A gloved hand shoved hard against an old man's chest. He staggered back off the porch and hit the frozen steps. His hat rolled into the snow. A younger man stood in the doorway, filling it, blocking the way back in. Behind the old man, a woman gripped the railing with both hands, her knuckles white in the cold. A dog barked once, low and hard, from the bed of a rusted truck. Nobody moved to help. The younger man threw a folded piece of paper. It landed in the snow at the old man's feet. "Take the cabin," he said. "It's all you get." The old man was 71 years old. His name was Hollis Brennan. He had taught school for 40 years, and now his own blood had thrown him into the snow. What waited for him at that cabin would bury them all. "Stay right with me." The paper in the snow was a note. Hollis picked it up with fingers that had gone stiff and red. The handwriting belonged to his nephew Dell. 6 words. "The place isn't worth the drive." Below that, a hand-drawn map and a rusted key taped to the bottom of the page. Now here's the thing you have to understand about Hollis Brennan. He was not a man who yelled. 40 years standing in front of children had taught him that the loudest voice in the room is usually the weakest. So he didn't yell at Dell. He just stood up, brushed the snow off his coat, and looked at the boy he had helped raise after his sister died. "Your mother wanted us to have the house," Hollis said. Dell shrugged. "My mother's gone, and the lawyer says the house comes to me. You get the cabin." "That's the will." He said it easy, like he was reading a grocery list. "Nothing personal, Uncle Hollis." But it was personal. Everybody standing in that yard knew it was personal. Maren came down the steps and took her husband's arm. She was 68, small, with silver hair pinned up under a wool scarf. She had taught piano to half the town. She looked at Dell for a long moment, and then she said the only thing she said the whole time. "You'll remember this day for the rest of your life." Dell laughed. He actually laughed. Then he went back inside their house, the house Hollis and Maren had lived in for 31 years, and he shut the door. They heard the lock turn. That was it. That was the whole inheritance. A key, a map, and a note that told them not to bother. Their old truck was already packed because Dell had made sure of that. 2 suitcases, a box of books, a crate of canned food Maren had grabbed from the pantry before the boy could stop her. And Juniper, their sled dog, a silver-muzzled Malamute so old her legs shook when she stood. She had been Hollis's dog for 13 winters. She rode in the truck bed under a canvas tarp, her big head resting on the tailgate, watching the house get smaller as they pulled away. Now you might ask why they didn't fight it, why they didn't get their own lawyer. The answer is money. They didn't have any. A retired schoolteacher's pension in the winter of 1971 barely covered heat and bread. Dell had the house. Dell had the savings account their sister left behind, and Dell had a lawyer in town who golfed with the judge. Hollis knew how that story ended. He had watched it end that way for other people his whole life. So they drove 200 miles into the Bitterroot backcountry of western Montana, up into country where the roads stopped being roads and turned into suggestions under the snow. The truck slid twice. Once, near the top of a pass, Hollis had to get out and put chains on the tires with hands he could barely feel, while Maren held the flashlight and Juniper watched from the truck bed and whined. They reached the place just before dark, and I'll tell you, when they saw it, Maren started to cry. Not loud. Just tears running down her face in the cold. The cabin was half swallowed by snow, logs gone gray and soft with rot. One window boarded over. The porch roof sagged in the middle like a broken back. A dead pine had fallen against one wall years ago and nobody had moved it. There was no power line, no phone line, no neighbor for 15 miles. It looked exactly like what Dell had promised. A place not worth the drive. "He was right," Maren whispered. "There's nothing here." Hollis didn't answer her. He was looking at the dog because Juniper had gone stiff in the truck bed. Her ears were up. Her nose was working the air, pulling at something none of them could see, and she was not looking at the cabin, she was looking past it, at the black shape of something behind it out in the snow field, a low ring of stones and rotten boards, an old well. Holly's got the door open with the rusted key and hauled their things inside. There was a stone fireplace, a table with 3 chairs, a bed frame with no mattress, and a stack of split wood somebody had left long ago. He got a fire going. He got Marin warm. He heated a can of beans on the coals and they ate them with 2 spoons, sitting close to the flames, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. Outside, the wind picked up and the snow came down harder, and the 2 of them and their old dog were alone at the top of the world with a note that said the place wasn't worth the drive. They slept that first night on the floor by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned, with juniper pressed between them for warmth. Holly's lay awake most of the night listening to the logs shift and groan and thinking about the locked door 200 miles behind him. By morning the storm had passed. The sky was hard and blue and the sun on the snow was almost blinding. Holly's went out at first light to gather more wood, and that was when he noticed Juniper was gone. She had never wandered off in 13 years. Never. Her hips were too bad for it. But her tracks led away from the cabin, straight across the snow field, and Holly's followed them with his heart going fast, because a dog that old out in that cold could freeze in an hour. He found her at the well. She was digging. Old as she was, she had her paws down in the snow, throwing it back between her legs, scraping at the frozen boards that capped the shaft. And she was making a sound he had never heard from her before. Not a bark, not a whine exactly. A kind of low crying deep in her chest, over and over as she pawed at those boards. "Junie," he said, "girl, come away from there." She wouldn't come. She looked back at him and then she looked down at the boards and she scraped at them again, harder. Holly's crouched down beside her. He put his hand on the old wood. It was crusted with ice and it was rotten, and one of the boards had already cracked under the dog's weight. He pulled at it. It came away in his hand with a wet, splintering sound. Below it was darkness. And out of that darkness came a smell. Not water, not rot, something dry, old canvas, wax, cold metal. Holly's went back to the cabin and got the lantern. Now I want you to picture this. An old man on his knees in the snow, his wife standing behind him with her hands over her mouth, and a 13-year-old dog lying flat beside the hole, her nose pointed straight down into it, whining. Holly's lit the lantern. He tied it to a length of rope from the truck, and he lowered it down into the well, hand over hand, watching the flame drop into the dark. The rope went down 8 feet, 10, 12, and then the lantern light spread out across the bottom of the shaft and Holly stopped breathing. There was no water down there. The well had been dry for 50 years, maybe more. Somebody had lined the bottom and the walls with tin and tar to keep the damp out. And on that dry stone floor, stacked from wall to wall, were crates. Wooden crates, sealed with wax and banded with iron. He counted them in the swinging lantern light. He lost count at 30. "Holly's," Marin said behind him. "What is it? What's down there?" He couldn't answer her. His mouth had gone dry. He lowered himself in. His knees screamed and his shoulders shook, but he braced his boots against the tin lining and worked his way down the shaft until his feet hit stone. He pulled the nearest crate toward him. The lid was nailed and waxed. He worked a board loose with the claw of his hammer, and it came free with a crack that echoed up the shaft. Inside, under a layer of oiled canvas, were rows and rows of small cloth sacks. He lifted one. It was heavy, heavier than it had any right to be. He pulled the drawstring open. Gold, coins, dozens of them gleaming yellow in the lantern light, stamped with an eagle and a date. 1899, 1904, double eagles, $20 a face in a time when $20 was a month's wages. And that was one sack, in one crate. Out of 30 he could see, and God knew how many he couldn't. Hollis Brennan sat down on the cold stone floor of that well with a sack of gold coins in his lap and started to laugh. And then he started to cry, and he could not have told you which was which. Above him, framed by a circle of blue sky, his wife and his old dog looked down at him and waited. For a little while up in that cabin, everything went quiet and warm. They hauled 2 crates up between them, one board at a time, and set them on the table by the fire. Hollis pried them open, and they laid the sacks out and counted and lost count and started again. There was gold. There were bundles of old paper too, bearer bonds and certificates in stiff waxed folders, the kind that pay whoever holds them. Marin made tea on the coals. Juniper stretched out by the fire and finally, after 3 days of whining, went quiet and slept. Hollis leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath. For the first time in a week, his shoulders came down from around his ears. The danger was behind them. The betrayal was behind them. They were rich and they were warm and they were safe, or so they thought. Then Juniper's head came up off the floor. She was staring at the door. A low growl started in her chest, and from outside, far off but coming closer, Hollis heard the whine of an engine climbing the last grade toward the cabin. He went to the window and scraped the frost away. 2 sets of headlights were cutting up through the dark, bouncing over the snow. Not one vehicle. 2. Coming fast, coming together, coming for the cabin at the top of the world where nobody was supposed to be. Marin stood up. "Nobody knows we're here," she said. "Dell said nobody comes up here." But Hollis already understood, and what he understood turned his blood to ice. Dell had sent them here on purpose, not because the cabin was worthless, because the cabin was worth everything, and Dell knew it, and Dell needed 2 old people to be the ones who found it and opened the well and never came back down the mountain to tell anyone. This wasn't about a house anymore. It wasn't about a will or a pension or an old grudge between family. Those headlights were about $300 million in gold at the bottom of a well and 2 witnesses standing over it. And you don't leave witnesses. Hollis took the gold sacks off the table and pushed them under the bed. His hands were steady now. Funny how that works. When the worst thing finally arrives, the shaking stops. If you've made it this far with me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the next part is where this old schoolteacher shows Dell exactly what 40 years in front of a classroom taught him. Now back to the cabin. The 2 trucks stopped in the yard. Doors slammed. Hollis counted the shapes crossing in front of the headlights. 3 men. One of them was Dell. One was a big man in a heavy coat who moved like he was used to trouble. And the third carried a leather case under his arm and walked careful, like a man who didn't want snow in his good shoes. A lawyer. Dell had brought a lawyer. Dell knocked on the door, polite as Sunday. "Uncle Hollis, it's me. I got worried about you 2 up here in the cold. Brought some folks to help." Hollis opened the door but stood in the gap, filling it the way Dell had filled the doorway of the house a week before. "That's kind of you," he said. "We're fine. We've got a fire and food. You drove a long way for nothing." Dell smiled. In the firelight his face looked older, meaner than Hollis remembered. "Can we come in? It's cold. This here's Mr. Sturgis, he's an attorney, and that's Cole, he helps me out with things." Cole, the big one, said nothing. He just looked past Hollis into the cabin, and his eyes went straight to the 2 open crates on the table. Nobody could take those eyes back. Dell saw where Cole was looking, and the smile fell right off his face. "So you found it," Dell said quietly. "The dog found it, I bet." Old man Elias always said a good dog would find it before a fool would. "Elias," Hollis said, "your great-grandfather, my uncle." "Our family's disgrace," Dell said, stepping inside, and Cole came in behind him and shut the door, and now there were 3 of them in the cabin and 2 old people and a dog. "You want to hear the story, Uncle Hollis, since we've got time. Elias Brennan didn't trust banks. Lost everything in the panic of '07, watched his own father lose it all in a run on the bank. So when he made his money back, in cattle and in silver, he never put a dime of it in a bank again. He turned it all into gold and government bonds, and he hid it. Told everybody the mountain place was worthless so nobody would ever look. He died in 1939 without telling a living soul where. The family's been chewing on the rumor for 30 years. And you found the rumor, Holly said. I found Elia's diary in the attic of the house you thought you should get. Dell's voice went hard. It said the fortune was at the winter cabin guarded by the well, but it didn't say the well was the vault. I couldn't very well come dig up the whole property myself, could I? Somebody'd ask questions. So I figured, send the two people nobody would miss. Let them freeze up here or let them find it, don't much matter which. Sign this, Uncle Holly's. The lawyer, Sturgis, opened his case and set a document on the table next to the gold. A quitclaim deed, he said smoothly, transferring all rights and contents of the property to my client. Standard language, just a signature. Hollies looked at the paper. Then he looked at his wife, who had moved, very quietly, to stand near the fireplace where the iron poker leaned against the stone. Then he looked at his dog, who had not stopped growling since the door opened. And if I don't sign? Hollies asked. Dell nodded at Cole. The big man reached into his coat and came out with a revolver, and he let it hang at his side, easy, pointed at the floor. Then it's a tragedy, Dell said. Two old folks snowed in, no heat, no help. Happens every winter up here, terrible thing. Nobody'd ever come looking. There it was, out in the open. The betrayal that had started with a shove on a porch was going to end with a gun in a cabin. Holly's Brennan took a slow breath. And here is where 40 years in a classroom paid for itself, because a man who has faced down 300 angry teenagers on the last day before summer break knows one thing better than anyone alive. He knows how to buy time. He knows how to make the loud, dangerous person in the room feel like he's already won. All right, Holly said. He let his shoulders slump. He let his voice shake just a little. All right. I'm an old man, Dell. I'm not going to die over money. Give me the pen. Dell relaxed. Cole relaxed. Even the lawyer smiled and slid the pen across the table. And that little bit of relaxing, that one loose breath the three of them let out, was all Holly's needed. Because Holly's Brennan had not been idle those 3 days in the snow. Down at the general store, 40 miles back, where they'd stopped for kerosene on the drive up, there had been a man behind the counter with a two-way radio and a badge that said Volunteer Fire. And Hollies, being a careful man, being a man who had raised the boy standing in front of him and knew exactly what kind of man that boy had become, had left a letter with that storekeeper. Sealed. To be mailed to the county sheriff and opened only if Hollies and Marin didn't come back down off the mountain by the first of the week. That was the first thing. But that letter was 200 miles and days away, and Dell's gun was right here. So the letter wasn't going to save them tonight. Hollies knew that. He needed something for tonight. He picked up the pen. He bent over the deed. And he said, without looking up, "You know, Dell, before I sign this, you should know what your great-grandfather wrote on the last page of that diary, the page you didn't read close enough." Dell frowned. "What are you talking about?" "There's a codicil." Holly said the word slow, the way he used to say a word he wanted the slow kids to remember. "A legal instrument. Elias didn't just hide the gold. He filed a deed of trust with the territorial court in 1912. The fortune passes to whoever holds the property honestly, not by force, not by fraud. There's a clause. If it's taken by threat, it reverts. Every bank and every court in this state would know that in a day. You can't spend gold that a judge already knows was stolen off 2 dead schoolteachers, Dell. You'd be caught the first time you walked into a bank with a 1904 Double Eagle. Where'd it come from? Who are you? And here's a couple in the ground up in the Bitterroot who own the very same coins. Now none of that was true. There was no codicil. Hollis was making it up standing there with a pen in his hand. But he said it the way he'd said everything for 40 years, calm and certain and a little bored, like a man stating a fact so obvious it was tiresome to explain. And Dell, who had never in his life been the smartest man in the room when Hollis was in it, felt the ground shift under him. "You're lying," Dell said, but his voice wasn't sure. "Am I?" said Hollis. "You want to bet $300 million and a murder charge on it?" "Because I taught civics for 40 years, boy. I know exactly how a bearer bond gets traced. Do you?" Cole, the big man with the gun, spoke for the first time. "Dell, he's got a point. I ain't going to prison over some coins I can't even sell." "Shut up," Dell snapped. And that was the crack. That's what Hollis had been digging for, the same way Juniper had dug at the boards over the well. A crack between the men. Get them looking at each other instead of at you. "Here's what's fair," Hollis said, and now he stood up straight, and his voice filled the little cabin the way it used to fill a schoolroom. "You put that gun away. We split it clean and legal. My name goes on the deed because it has to, because the trust says the honest holder collects. Then you get your share, paid out proper, traceable, no prison. Or you shoot us and you spend the rest of your short life trying to unload cursed gold and you hang. Those are the two doors, Dell. Pick one." For a long moment nobody moved. The fire popped. The wind pushed at the door. Cole looked at Dell. The lawyer had gone pale and was edging toward the wall. Juniper's growl had climbed into a snarl, and her old body was up off the floor now, hackles high, all 13 years of her wanting nothing in the world but to be let loose. Then Dell's face twisted, and Hollis saw the boy give up on being smart and decide to be angry instead. "No," Dell said. "No, it's mine. It's all mine." And he grabbed the revolver out of Cole's hand and swung it up toward the old man. 3 things happened at once. Maren threw the iron poker. She'd been standing by the fire the whole time and nobody had watched her, because who watches a small gray-haired woman? And the poker caught Dell across the wrist and the gun went off into the ceiling. Juniper left the floor. Old as she was, hips and all, that Malamute crossed the cabin in one silver blur and hit Dell in the chest and took him down, and her jaws closed on the arm that held the gun. And Hollis Brennan, 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, picked up the second chair and brought it down across the back of the big man, Cole, who had lunged for the fallen revolver, and Cole went face down on the floorboards and stayed there. The gun spun across the floor and stopped at the lawyer's feet. Sturgis looked down at it. He looked at the old man, and the old woman with the poker and the dog, and his own client screaming on the floor with 100 pounds of Malamute on his chest. And the lawyer did the smartest thing anyone did that night. He raised both hands high in the air and said, very clearly, "I want it on the record that I did not touch that weapon." It was over in maybe 10 seconds. It had taken 30 years of a family's greed to build, and it ended in 10 seconds on the floor of a cabin nobody thought was worth the drive. Hollis picked up the revolver. He didn't point it at anyone. He just held it, and he told Juniper in a soft voice to let go. And the old dog let go and backed up, and stood in front of Maren, still snarling, her muzzle red where she'd bitten down. "You're going to sit in those chairs," Hollis said. "All 3 of you, until morning. And in the morning we're all going to drive down this mountain together nice and slow, and we're going to have a talk with the sheriff. Because I left him a letter, Dell, sealed at the store to be opened if we didn't come back. And when I don't walk into that store tomorrow to tell him we're fine, he's going to open it. So you can sit here and behave, or you can run out into the snow tonight and freeze. Your choice. You've always liked giving people the worthless choice. Now you've got one of your own." They sat. There wasn't anything else to do. A man with a gun he won't use is still a man with a gun, and Dell had run out of clever. He held his bitten arm and stared at the fire and said nothing for the rest of that long night. Hollis and Marin took turns staying awake, the revolver on the table between them, Juniper stretched out at their feet with her old eyes open. Outside, the wind died down and the stars came out over the Bitterroot, hard and bright and cold. They drove down the mountain at first light, just like Hollis said. 2 trucks and the old couple's rusted one, moving slow through the snow, single file. When they reached the general store, the storekeeper was already on his radio, because the letter had a date on it and Hollis had told him plain what to do. The county sheriff met them on the road 20 miles down with 2 deputies and a lot of questions. The questions took months to answer. There was the matter of the gun going off, and the lawyer's careful testimony, and a diary found in a house 200 miles away, and a deed of trust that, as it turned out, actually did exist, filed by Elias Brennan in a territorial court in 1912, though it said nothing about codicils or reverting fortunes. Hollis had guessed the shape of the truth even when he was making up the details. Elias really had hidden his money because he didn't trust banks, and he really had left the property in a trust, and the trust really did name the honest heir. Hollis and Marin, the 2 the family had thrown away, were the only living Brennans who'd taken the place as it was given in good faith and moved in and lived there. The court counted it all in the spring, when the well-thought-in men in suits stood around the shaft with clipboards, gold coins, bearer bonds, silver certificates, and old land warrants. When they were finished counting, the number they read out loud was $295 million. Dell went to prison. Not for 30 years the way it might have gone, but for enough. Cole took a deal and testified. The lawyer, Sturgis, kept his license by the width of a hair and never worked in that county again. Hollis and Marin did not move into a mansion. People asked them why. They had $295 million, and they stayed in a small house in town, near the school where he had taught and the church where she had played piano for 40 years. Hollis said money was like a loud voice in a room. The more of it you had, the more it wanted to do your thinking for you, and he had spent his whole life teaching children not to let the loudest thing in the room do their thinking. They gave most of it away. They built a music hall for the town, with Marin's name on the door, though she fought them on that. They paid the tuition of every child in 3 counties who wanted to go to college and couldn't. They set up a fund so that no old person in the Bitterroot would ever again be handed the worthless thing and told it wasn't worth the drive. And they kept the cabin, fixed the porch roof, patched the walls, moved the fallen pine. Every summer they drove up, the 2 of them, and sat by the well that had held a fortune, and remembered how close they had come to freezing over the top of it and never knowing. Juniper made 2 more summers. She died in her sleep by the fire in that cabin, an old silver dog who had done the one great thing of her life at 13 years old, when her legs shook and her hips ached, and she crossed the snow anyway because she smelled something under the boards that nobody else could smell. They buried her behind the cabin, near the well. Hollis carved the marker himself. It didn't say much, just her name and under it 3 words. She found it. Years later, when Hollis was very old and sitting on that mended porch in the sun, a young reporter came all the way up the mountain to ask him the question everybody asked. How does it feel to be betrayed by your own family, thrown out in the snow, and then to end up with everything? And Hollis thought about a gloved hand shoving him off a porch. He thought about a note in the snow that said the place wasn't worth the drive. He thought about his wife saying, "You'll remember this day for the rest of your life," and how right she'd turned out to be, only not the way Dell thought. "They didn't throw us out of anything," Hollis said. "They handed us the one thing they were too greedy to look at: clothes. That's the whole story of greedy people, son. They can't see what's right in front of them because they're already looking past it at more. He scratched the ears of the young dog at his feet, another Malamute, a granddaughter of Juniper's line. The house was never the prize. The well was the prize. And the only ones who found it were the ones who came up here with nothing but an old dog and a note that told them not to bother. The reporter wrote that down. Then he asked one last thing. Did Hollis ever feel angry, after all of it, at the family that did this to him? Hollis looked out at the snow field, at the ring of stones behind the cabin, at the small grave with 3 words on the marker. "No," he said. "You can't hate somebody for handing you your whole life and calling it garbage. I ought to send Dell a thank you card." And the old schoolteacher smiled, quiet and certain, the way he'd smiled at the front of a classroom for 40 years, and he did not say another word.